The Narviks, or Type 1936As as they were known in Germany, began life in the immediate run-up to World War II. Although the French contre-torpilleurs had not changed the calibre of their guns, they had increased their number from 5 to 8 on the latest ships. Additionally, the Royal Navy was just commissioning the Tribal class, and whilst the 4.7-inch gun was slightly smaller than the German 127mm gun, there were again 8 of them. This, and a number of other related factors, led to the Kriegsmarine deciding that the path to superiority in destroyers lay in keeping their own gun numbers at 5, but upping the calibre to 150mm, or 5.9-inch, which is a light cruiser calibre. Given the size of German destroyer designs, this made some sense on paper. An approximately 6-inch caliber gun was widely accepted as being capable of stopping or sinking a destroyer with relatively few shots as compared to lighter guns, so as long as you could start scoring hits at around the same time as your opponent, the larger weapons should in theory do considerably more damage and knock out the enemy before their theoretically more numerous hits could start to overwhelm you. However, 5 guns of such size were a little difficult to place, even on a hull that was well over 2,500 tons standard displacement, bearing in mind that there were light cruisers more than double that only had 1 additional gun at this calibre. And so a compromise solution was reached. As planned, the ships would carry 2 guns in a twin mounting forward, with 3 single mounts aft, a pair super-firing, and then the third on the same level as the super-firing gun, but slightly further forward. This would be complemented by a pair of twin 37mm anti-aircraft guns and a number of 20mm weapons, some in single mounts and some in the famous Flak-Vierling quad mount. 2 quadruple torpedo launchers with space for reloads and some depth charge launchers would complete the weapon's loadout. Speed would be 36 knots, courtesy of 69,000 shaft horsepower which drove 2 shafts, but problems began to emerge before the ships had even left the slipways. Whilst their stability was generally an improvement on earlier German destroyers, as the vessels no longer displayed a strong desire to cosplay as U-boats, the main armament proved to be something of a problem. The twin mount was delayed in production, which meant that of the 15 ships within the class, which were completed to 2 slightly different specifications, but more on that later, the 8 original ships and one of the latter 7 were completed with 4 single mounts instead. In most cases, this simply replaced the twin with a single, but Z-28 moved one of the aft guns forward for a 2 forward, 2 aft layout. Of these 9 ships, 5 would later receive the twin mount, and the latter class, bar 1, would complete with the mount from the start. In common with many other German destroyers of the period, the high-pressure engines used to give them their speed proved to be something of a maintenance nightmare which limited their availability. Their main batteries also proved to be an issue in another way. Their great weight relative to the ship's size meant that in high seas the ship's seakeeping suffered considerably, and the guns themselves would prove difficult to work in a quickly pitching and rolling vessel. Whilst this was not always a problem in the North Sea or off the coast of France, it would be a considerable issue in Arctic waters. Finally, the ships turned out to have minimal actual anti-aircraft capability. The single 5.9-inch mounts couldn't elevate past 30 degrees, and the twins, when and where you could find them, could do 65 degrees, but obviously only in the forward arc, and in any case a near 6-inch gun wasn't the best anti-aircraft weapon anyway for this time period. The 37mm SKC-30 gun was painfully slow to fire, probably one of the least capable medium-caliber anti-aircraft weapons of the war in this respect, and the mountings were also not up to the task of keeping them stable on a rapidly manoeuvring destroyer, and destroyers under attack do tend to be rather rapidly manoeuvring. The 20mm weapons were at least decent, but they could only engage aircraft that had already likely dropped their payloads of bombs or torpedoes on the ship. Z-23 through Z-30 were built to the original specification, and they would enter service between 1940 and 1941. Z-31 through 39 were built to the revised specification, this being a slightly larger hull, and with it came a more reliable power plant. These came online in 1942 and 43. During the war, various upgrades would of course be made to the surviving ships, which included improved radar, improved underwater sensors, and more 37mm and 20mm guns. A number of ships would also receive the much superior 37mm M42 weapon, which would either replace or supplement the C-30s depending on the ship. Despite being fairly heavily engaged off of the French and Norwegian coasts and making up the bulk of the Kriegsmarine's destroyer force in the aftermath of Narvik, the class proved to be remarkably durable, losing only one ship in 1942 and another in 1943, both to surface actions with British cruisers. 1944, though, was a bad year. Z-23 was knocked out of the war by a bomb, Z-24 was sunk by air attack, and Z-37 was written off in a collision with Z-32 a few months before Z-32 herself was destroyed by HMCS Hyder and HMCS Huron. Z-28 was sunk in an air attack in 1945, and the survivors were then distributed amongst the Allies. Most of them were fairly rapidly disposed of, with the exception of a Z-25 and Z-31, which were taken into French service and would actually serve until the late 1950s. With the repaired Z-23, as long with Z-39, serving briefly in the French Navy before being used as a source of spares for the first two.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.